In today's episode, I sit down with Drs. Carol Kirkpatrick and Kevin Maki, both true domain-specific experts who have dedicated their research careers to better understanding the way in which nutrition affects cardiometabolic disease. In this episode, you will learn about the main risk factors for developing cardiometabolic disease, how protein can reduce hunger and the mechanisms that explain this, how a certain type of dietary fiber might increase the satiety-inducing effects of protein, how ectopic fat, this fat inside our organs, is critical to the development of poor metabolic health, why it's not fair to assume that overweight people are less disciplined, evidence-based ways to reduce hunger so you can better manage your body weight, details about their new study that they are currently in the process of setting up, the 30-30-30 study, and plenty more. It is a very detailed conversation, a good mix of science, practical information that I think adds very nicely to previous conversations with the likes of Professor Roy Taylor, Dr. Christos Mansouros, and Dr. Thomas Dayspring. I hope you enjoy it. I've been reading your work, it seems like now for like almost a decade, I think, but at this point, and it's surprising to me that it's taken, I started the show in 2018, so 6-7 years ago to this point to have you both on. So it's a real treat. I mean, that's why I started the show originally, was so that I could connect with domain specific experts and give them a platform and be able to showcase the research that they've done in their careers. So I'm hoping that we can do that today. Kevin, while we're on a roll here with dad jokes, I got one for you.
Okay.
What do you call a man who's just finished digging? Doug.
God.
Do you want to share yours?
Sure. You know what you call a guy that's in a tiger cage? Claude.
Oh my God. I will not be part of this. I will just enjoy the talent of you two.
We won't put you on the spot, Carol. There might be a few more dad jokes along the way. Shout out to Zachary Wegner,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think he's a dietitian, an up-and-coming nutrition scientist. Mm-hmm. Is he a PhD student of yours, or?
He actually reached out to Kevin over a year ago for advice on the study he's doing for his master's thesis, which I think he's going to start recruiting for that very soon, if he hasn't already. So that's how we first met Zachary. And then he reached out again more recently. And he is looking at his PhD and what he wants to do for his PhD, and then wants to become more involved in the National Lipid Association. So that's where we had a conversation via Zoom more recently, Zachary and I. And then from there, he suggested connecting.
Yeah. So thank you, Zach, for helping organize this. And National Lipid Association being something that both of you are quite heavily involved in. What is the National Lipid Association?
Well, it's an organization. It's, I think, about 22 years old now. And it was started by people who specialized in treating lipid disorders. And so they were kind of looking for a community because at the time, specialists in treating lipid disorders were not that common. And so they created a community with an objective to educate clinicians about lipids and cardiovascular disease risk. And so I was privileged to be the president during the 20th year. And it's been a great organization that does, I think, a great job with education for clinicians, and it's multidisciplinary. That's one of its real strengths. So they have not only physicians, but dietitians, pharmacists, nurses, physician assistants, exercise physiologists, and so forth.
Right, and so they're providing the latest evidence-based kind of recommendations pertaining to both lifestyle and pharmacology, and how that can be used to optimize lipids or improve lipids.
Yeah, exactly. So they have meetings, and they have educational programs that they offer. They have a foundations course that Carol's a faculty member in, and a master's course that I'm a faculty member in, and then various other activities. There's a journal. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical Lipidology, so it's a great organization. We'd love people listening to consider becoming members.
Both of you have resumes or bios that are just too long to kind of go through. They're off the charts in terms of qualifications and appointments. And I was trying to think of a very simple sort of one sentence way of describing what it is that the two of you do. And when I stripped it all back, I was left with understanding how nutrition and pharmacology affects cardiometabolic disease. Does that sound pretty fair and reasonable?
I think that's spot on. Yeah.
And Carol, did you begin as a dietitian and then moved into research, or was your plan always to go into science and thinking about scientific investigation of how food affects health?
I don't think I've ever thought about doing scientific investigation to learn about all that. I kind of fell into what I'm doing. So, some people have a very clear path of what they are doing, and mine has never been really clear. I just kind of have gone the way life went. So I started as a dietitian. I knew I eventually would do further education. So I have an MPH in health ed. I think I bring the practical expertise. I like educating people and helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve. Earned a PhD because somebody on my master's thesis told me to.
What was your PhD in?
It was in health education and with a supporting area nutrition. And so I don't really have a strong research background, but I have always enjoyed learning. I think I'm like a perpetual student, and I think I'm curious. And then met Kevin through the NLA, and it's really been through the relationship I've had with Kevin in terms of like papers we've written together for the NLA and then outside of the NLA. And Kevin's definitely the researcher, and I'm just continually learning, I think, from you.
An educator, and as a researcher, I feel like our job isn't done until we get the information to people who can use it. And so, I've always been sort of an educator researcher, and, Carol has stepped in as someone with a strong education background, and that's been a great addition to our team.
Yeah, that combination seems really important, because when you're designing studies and thinking about the types of interventions, having someone who has experience on the education practical side of things can help you create an intervention that actually could be used in the real world.
I agree. I also think that because this is just my opinion, but because I don't have a specific research path, I am a little bit more curious and open to, looking at the evidence and not necessarily being locked into one certain thing.
No dog in the hunt.
No, exactly.
When did your interest in lipids kind of begin, or when did you kind of start to focus on lipids as a specialty? 2007.
I left academia, actually. I was a faculty at Idaho State University and wanted to be part-time. I had my daughter, my second child, and academia is a little bit difficult when you're trying to raise children. For me, my choice was to leave and go and work at a cardiology practice. I had a friend who was the practice administrator, and luckily she wanted to hire me, and they were just looking at creating a cardiovascular risk management clinic. And so with my background and having the PhD, being able to help them create protocols for essentially implementing this risk management clinic for their patients, the NLA actually had at that time workshops where you can go, and basically Ralph LaForge, who we miss, but he provided these workshops.
He's not dead.
No. He's
just more mainly retired.
Yes, yeah. He is. He's an amazing photographer, and he's out doing what he loves. But I'm glad you clarified that. But so that's when I started going to the NLA meetings, and it was, I learned about lipids a little bit in school, but it was just fascinating to me. I remember distinctly at my first NLA meeting, and I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And so I was able to continue to learn from those meetings, and earn my clinical lipid specialist and all that good stuff. So that's when I got into it.
Kevin, we're going to bring you into the game in a second. I'm conscious that Carol's a little bit like me, a little shy, so I wanted to start with you. You mentioned earlier that your kind of clinical background is perhaps sets you up for being quite open-minded when it comes to research. Since 2007, how have your, I guess, views overall when it comes to diet and thinking about an individual, the way that they're eating to improve their cardiovascular or cardiometabolic health, how has that changed at all in a material way?
That's a big question, Simon. I mean, yes, I think for me, what I learned in working with people and then just over the course of the years, you have to work with each individual. And I think a lot of times people want to say, this is the right way to do it. This is what everybody should be doing. And I think that can limit people from being successful. Our mantra is you have to individualize your approach, whether that's pharmacotherapy, whether that's lifestyle interventions. You really need to figure out what's best for the patient, not only in terms of what's going on with their health conditions, but what is going on with their preferences, their life that might be a challenge. I think there are overarching nutrition recommendations that we're all familiar with that we believe people should be trying to adhere to. So Kevin's tattoo, which is eating whole grains, fruits, vegetables,
nuts, seeds, legumes, non-tropical oils.
Yes.
Wait, is this an actual tattoo or?
No, this is a joke. So during a talk, I said I have this tattooed on my forearm: whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, non-tropical oils. And I thought everyone would understand it was a joke, but then lots of people were asking to see my tattoo. And I said, no, I don't really have that on my forearm.
But we believe that's how people, because based on the evidence, observational mostly, but we do see an association with improved cardiometabolic health. But then from there, you have to tweak it. You have to work with people.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. So when you say personalized, it's not that, you end up with two individuals adopting two really extreme diets that are distinctly different to one another. There is a kind of theme or framework of recommendations, right, and then personalization within that, yes, which I think is often, lost a little bit online.
I think so too.
Kevin, I think you've been involved in 300 or more clinical trials and observational studies at this point.
Yep, at least, yeah.
How would you kind of describe your career and your research interests? If you sat down with someone at dinner that was not in academia and not a scientist and said, hey, Kevin, what do you do?
Well, I'll tell you where I started. So I got a master's degree in exercise physiology, preventive and rehabilitative cardiovascular health. And I thought I was going to go work in cardiac rehab with patients who had had bypass surgery or heart attacks, etc. And I did that for about 3 months and realized, wow, I hate this. It was so boring. It was just the same thing every day. And I said, this is not going to work for me. So I eventually got a job as kind of a technician in the Department of Veterans Affairs in a research lab. And I loved that. Then started working on a PhD in nutrition. Got most of the way through that, and the department I was in had something like 10 faculty members leave in 1 year. And that included anyone doing anything of interest to me. So I switched and became the accidental epidemiologist. So I finished a PhD in epidemiology. And it turns out that, like many things in my life, what seemed like a disaster at the time turned out to be the absolute best thing, because that preparation of exercise physiology, nutrition, and epidemiology was the perfect preparation for what I ended up doing. Okay, so then let's fast forward. I had this job in the VA, loved it, thought I'd worked there for 40 years, retire, and we got a new director for the center that I worked in, and he said, we're turning this into a neuroscience center. And he asked me, are you a neuroscientist? I said no, so he invited me to find other employment. And I ended up joining a private research center that was founded by a cardiologist, Michael Davidson. And so I ended up running the Human Nutrition and Metabolism Research Unit at that research center for 10 years. Left there and started my own private research center, which I sold in 2011. And then got quickly tired of having a boss in France because the company I sold to was a French company, and then did it again and started another private research center. Kind of, it's a little complicated. I merged one that I founded with a friend of mine. And so we sold that in 2011. And what we have left is this small company that mainly does consulting and designs and conducts clinical trials as a sort of boutique contract research organization. So we specialize in cardiometabolic health and lipids particularly, but lots of other things related mainly to cardiometabolic health and then also cognitive function.
You mentioned, Carol, that a lot of the research that informs current dietary guidelines for cardiometabolic health is from long-term observational studies. And I'm interested, I guess, here, Kevin, you've had experience in observational studies, you're involved in clinical trials. How do you think about the two in terms of how they inform nutrition recommendations? And what do you think about this idea that certainly I still come across today that observational studies really cannot be relied upon, particularly in nutrition science, when food frequency questionnaires have problems and people can't even remember what they ate yesterday, let alone last week?
I think observational studies have a place, and in my view, they're mostly hypothesis generating, but we can't test everything in clinical trials. It's just not practical. Sometimes it's not ethical to do that. So, what I say is we'll never have a clinical trial where we randomly assign people to smoke or not smoke and then see what happens to them. We'll also not have a clinical trial on parachutes. Hard to get volunteers for that. And so you can't test everything with a clinical trial. And in nutrition, you have this challenge that we're looking at small effects that are on disease processes that often take decades to evolve. And so trying to randomly assign people to follow this diet for 15 years versus a different approach for 15 years is probably not going to be practical. So we have to use the best evidence that we have. Observational evidence can most of the time point us in the right direction, but not every time. So the classic example that happened early in my career was with postmenopausal estrogen and estrogen progestin therapy. And in 1996, I was at the International Congress on the Menopause in Sydney, Australia. I know, try and contain your excitement. And the keynote speaker started by saying the question at this point is not whether postmenopausal estrogen protects against cardiovascular disease. The question is, how does it work? And about a year later, the results from a trial that she was involved with and we were involved with read out, and there was no benefit to estrogen progestin. And then the Women's Health Initiative later on confirmed no benefit and, in fact, actual harm with estrogen plus progestin. And so that was an example where the epidemiology for lots of outcomes pointed us in the right direction, but for cardiovascular disease, it didn't. And so I think that we just have to be a bit careful. And with regard to observational evidence, sometimes it's the best we have. And so we need to, acknowledge the limitations.
Is that a similar story in some ways to HDL cholesterol being protective?
Oh, yeah. Many studies have shown that a higher level of HDL cholesterol is associated with lower cardiovascular risk. But subsequently, we've got intervention studies with niacin and CETP inhibitors that raise HDL cholesterol but did not lower cardiovascular risk. And we've got Mendelian randomization studies that show that genetic variants that influence LDL cholesterol or triglycerides, which also can be thought of as VLDL cholesterol, they do influence risk, but those that influence only HDL cholesterol are not associated with risk in either direction. And so it appears likely that we have a lot more to learn about HDL and whether it's actually protective, and if so, what are the mechanisms. But just raising HDL cholesterol does not seem to provide the benefit that we thought it would years ago.
Right. But these are examples where you see some type of effect or signal in observational studies. You begin to research that area through clinical trials, and the results suggest that you need to change your hypothesis or position. And really, I mean, at least the way that I look at nutrition science is these different study designs are kind of answering different questions or different pieces of the puzzle, and you're looking for them to converge and point in the one direction.
Yeah, and sometimes they do. So ApoB, apolipoprotein B lowering, LDL cholesterol lowering, the observational evidence suggested that that was likely to be beneficial. And then the interventional studies confirmed that it is in fact beneficial, and lower for longer is better when it comes to atherogenic lipoproteins. So, a lot of times the epidemiology points us in the right direction. Sometimes it's a bit tricky and more complicated than we think.
Are there any areas of food and lipidology, cardiometabolic disease, where you've done a full 180 degrees in terms of how your position on something?
I don't know if a full 180, but I'll say that maybe in the 90s, I was very much a proponent of the idea that monounsaturated fatty acids were going to be the most protective against cardiovascular disease. And I had concerns about polyunsaturated, omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids because of their potential to be oxidized. And also they tended to lower HDL cholesterol a little bit, at least compared with saturated fats, for instance. And so, I'm going to warn you, there'll be hate mail from the seed oil people.
Well, yeah, there's still a lot of people on the internet that still share those same concerns about inflammation, oxidative stress.
And so, subsequently from studies that we've done and studies that others have done, it looks pretty clear to me from the available evidence with its limitations that omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are having a beneficial effect. That doesn't mean that monounsaturated fatty acids aren't beneficial also. But, what I say is I talk about the 4 white poisons. So, saturated fat, salt, added sugars, and refined starches. And these are the kinds of things that I'm saying generally that we should be limiting, not eliminating, but limiting in the diet. And so, with regard to, the way I looked at things years ago, it was much more about lowering total fat, lowering saturated fat. Now I'm more of the opinion that we should be emphasizing dietary patterns, and then I'll repeat, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, non-tropical oils, and limit the 4 white poisons.
Repeat the 4 white poisons for us again.
So saturated fat, salt, added sugars, and refined starches. And I say that tongue-in-cheek. We're not talking about, these are terrible things that are going to kill you on Tuesday. We're just saying that the average American diet has more of those than is probably optimal. And so emphasizing the other foods as replacements for foods that are high in the 4 white poisons, I think is generally a good thing.
We'll probably come back to fats a little bit later, but while we're on this, given that you just mentioned there that polyunsaturated fats appear from the available evidence to be beneficial. I'm assuming when you say beneficial for cardiometabolic disease. There's a question that I keep getting from folks online who have adopted a low total fat diet, and perhaps they've done that successfully and lost some weight, and their LDL cholesterol or ApoB has come down. And through the information they've been exposed to over the years, they have thought that all fat should be reduced, and are now questioning that. And the question that they have, I think, is, are polyunsaturated fats inherently beneficial, or are they just better than saturated fat? So ultimately, would it be better for them to stay low total fat, or adding in polyunsaturated fats from whether it's vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, these types of foods?
So the answer in nutrition is always compared to what? And so compared to saturated fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids are associated mostly in observational studies with improved cardiometabolic health outcomes. So that's cardiovascular disease and diabetes. We have a couple of clinical trials, the Predimed study and Cardioprev, that used a Mediterranean type diet. And a Mediterranean type diet that was about 40% of the energy from carbohydrate. So it wasn't a high carbohydrate diet, but it wasn't a very low carbohydrate diet. And these diets were enriched with sources of monounsaturated fatty acids. And so I think the evidence supports the idea that these are actually beneficial relative to saturated fats for sure, but also to refined carbohydrates. It's a little bit of a different question if you say, well, compared to whole grains, for instance, carbohydrates from whole grains, then it's a little less clear. And so it's always compared to what? And the American diet is a bit higher than we'd like to see in saturated fatty acids and quite a bit higher than we'd like to see in refined starches and added sugars. So, to the degree that you bring those down, that's probably a good thing. And what you replace them with is probably also important.
Yeah, I think typically this question that I see is coming from someone who's eating a very healthy dietary pattern, and it's low total fat, it's high in carb, but those are carbohydrates from whole grains and legumes and different vegetables.
Yeah, it's they're eating quinoa and so forth as opposed to white bread.
Right. So it's like, are you familiar with the Ornish kind of diet? It's like that diet versus the same diet with slightly reduced carbohydrates coming from these unrefined plant foods and adding in more polyunsaturated fats. And the question is, which of those two ways of eating do you think would be better for cardiometabolic health? Or are we splitting hairs at this stage?
Yeah, I think at that stage we're splitting hairs. And what I'm more concerned with is a person's risk factor profile. And so for different people, they're going to be better off with one type of a diet versus another. So especially someone who has insulin resistance, generally they're going to be a bit better off if they have a little bit lower carbohydrate intake and low glycemic load, that they're emphasizing whole grains and sources of carbohydrates that are not added sugars, refined starches. But for other people who may have a different metabolic profile, then if you look at marathon runners, well, marathon runners can often consume huge amounts of carbohydrates and their metabolic profile looks great. So it's somewhat
right. So it's going to come back to what does your HbA1c look like? What does fasting glucose look like? What does ApoB look like?
Right.
And so do we understand if someone was to reduce calories from unrefined carbohydrates and instead add in polyunsaturated fats, how does that affect ApoB or LDL cholesterol?
Generally, that's going to lower.
Oh, really?
So
there
adding
in more fat would lower ApoB in that context.
And so omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids lower LDL cholesterol and ApoB more than, say, monounsaturated fatty acids and more than starches. So even if you're talking about whole grains, you're still talking about starch as compared to unsaturated fats. So in a study we did compared to a higher carbohydrate, low saturated fat diet, adding corn oil, which is high in linoleic acid, lowered LDL cholesterol by about 11%, 10.5%. And then extra virgin olive oil lowered LDL cholesterol by about 3.5%. So, there was good news for both because the olive oil also reduced heart rate and blood pressure. So that's why I'm not saying, focus here and not here. I'm saying non-tropical oils as a replacement for saturated fatty acids and or refined starches and added sugars, that's the direction.
I think there was also perhaps a slide that you sent me, Carol. Was there a study that the Eco-Atkins diet, and is that another piece of evidence where in that instance, a higher total fat diet that was mostly unsaturated fats, I think the LDL cholesterol was lower than the other group, which was a high carb, low total fat diet.
Right. I'm not as familiar with that study as Kevin would be, but the point we were trying to make in that presentation was that, and I know you've discussed this on the podcast before, but low carb diets in some people can increase their LDL cholesterol level. And it depends on genetics. It depends on what they're replacing the carbohydrate with. If they're having a higher amount of saturated fat intake, dietary cholesterol. So there are examples in the literature and studies. There's been a study actually done in Australia as well with people with type 2 diabetes, where they put them on a very low carb diet. And then the Eco Atkins, which is actually not a very low carb, it was a low carb. So they didn't necessarily get into ketosis. Yes. Yeah. But if you create a low carb or very low carb dietary pattern that is well formulated, if you want to call it that, replacing the carb with unsaturated fats, foods that are rich in unsaturated fats, you can get a favorable lipoprotein lipid profile without, because you're replacing it with the correct macronutrients to achieve that.
Allow me to introduce you to Momentous, my go-to supplement brand for all things protein and creatine. It's pretty easy, especially if you're not tracking everything that you eat, to fall short of the optimal daily protein intake. To help reach my daily protein target, I complement my diet with 1.5 scoops of Momentous's chocolate or vanilla chai plant-based protein for 30 grams of protein and all essential amino acids, which supports muscle growth, hormone and collagen production, skin health, and recovery. I also consume 10 grams of Momentous' creatine daily to enhance energy production, muscle strength, bone health, and cognition, with studies now showing the benefit of creatine on short-term memory and intelligence. I'll do anything for a little extra brain power. And what's really cool is that both products are NSF certified. This certification is the only third-party certification program trusted by the likes of the NBA, the MLB, Ironman, etc. With this, you can be confident that Momentous' protein and creatine are free from unsafe levels of contaminants, prohibited substances, or masking agents, and that what is on the label actually matches what is in the product. For discounts on these supplements, visit livemomentous.com and use code LIVINGPROOF for up to 36% off on subscriptions or 20% off one-time purchases. That's livemomentous.com with code LIVINGPROOF at checkout. We should define cardiometabolic disease. What does that actually mean?
So I usually define it in terms of several things. And so cardiovascular disease, obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and then also renal disease. And recently, the American Heart Association has really been emphasizing that all of these things kind of track together. And I would add to that dementia. So some people are referring to dementia now as type 3 diabetes because dementia has many of the same risk factors as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And so this constellation of things share lots of similar risk factors. And so if you manage those risk factors, you tend to reduce the risk for all of those cardiometabolic diseases.
What are the main risk factors that you guys are kind of concentrating on?
So we have an acronym for that. Do you want to use the acronym or should I?
You should use it.
Okay. FLASH GLE.
I was like, I think I know what you mean, but just to make sure, you should use it.
Okay. So FLASH GLE, family history, low HDL cholesterol, age, smoking, hypertension, and then GLI is GLI, glucose metabolism, lipids, and inflammation. So these are the risk factors that some are modifiable, some are not, but these are the things that we use to assess risk, and then for those that are modifiable, we try and intervene with lifestyle and pharmacotherapy as needed to make sure that they're all at desirable levels.
So how is a country like America currently going at addressing these?
Not well.
I would say not so great.
To add to that, not well, and things seem to be getting worse rather than better. So for years, I would give talks and I would talk about how fantastic things have been going since the 1970s. Cardiovascular disease mortality and morbidity going down like a ski slope, just getting better and better and better. And then in about 2015, that ski slope turned in the other direction. Cardiovascular mortality started to go up, and it's been continuing in the wrong direction. And there are probably a variety of reasons for that. One is the high prevalence of obesity, and the high prevalence of obesity has been followed by an increased prevalence of type 2 diabetes. But there are other factors likely at play as well. But I'd say that there's a lot of work to do.
Is obesity if you were to try and rank those risk factors, is that the single greatest risk factor? It also is affecting some of those other risk factors too.
I agree. I was actually going to make the comment that a person who has obesity is going to be more likely to have metabolic dysfunction, either prediabetes, insulin resistance that progresses to type 2, but also hypertension, so high blood pressure, most likely dyslipidemia, where we're seeing elevated triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol. So I think it is a precursor for...
I would say that for type 2 diabetes, by far, obesity is the strongest risk factor. For cardiovascular disease or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, I'd say the seeds are ApoB containing lipoproteins. So atherogenic lipoproteins, I'd say obesity, hypertension, smoking, etc., are the fertilizer. And so, it's a combination of things. And for different diseases, there are different contributors. So as an example, elevated ApoB and elevated blood pressure are risk factors for both heart disease and stroke, but elevated blood pressure is a stronger risk factor for stroke than heart disease, and elevated ApoB is a stronger risk factor for heart disease than it is for stroke.
And so ApoB being the seed, if you were to just treat that risk factor, you can significantly reduce someone's risk of atherosclerosis, but if all those other risk factors maintain, then they still have high risk of these other metabolic conditions.
And I just want to point out, sorry to interrupt, that some people who do not have obesity are going to deal with these risk factors as well. So we cannot just say, if a person's lean, they may not be at risk for hypertension or metabolic syndrome or that type of thing. So just to clarify, you don't have to have you don't have to be a person with obesity to be struggling with some of these risk factors.
Have you guys come across Jordan Peterson ever online?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have not.
He's a psychiatrist and pretty outspoken when it comes to nutrition. And I think he has a view that is shared by many people that you just mentioned there that it looks like cardiometabolic disease, if anything, is getting worse in this country. And a lot of people hear that and then they think, therefore, all of these recommendations that have been given over the last 30, 40 years about food, dietary guidelines, these things must be wrong and it's time for change. What are your thoughts when you hear someone kind of use that logic?
I think it's flawed. I think basically that, we've got very good evidence about these risk factors being causally related to atherosclerotic disease. And so, we can make recommendations. I can recommend that somebody put a treadmill in their house and use it every day. That doesn't mean they're doing it. And so one of the problems is we make recommendations, but people aren't necessarily following them. I think there were some mistakes in recommendations that were made in the 80s, for instance, where the emphasis was on a low-fat diet and not so much on what you replace the fat with. And so there was a lot of, replacing fat with sugar. I think that was...
Right, so people got confused and then just went and grabbed whatever product said low fat. Thinking automatically healthy, not knowing on the back of the label there was 20 grams of added sugar.
Exactly. So I think that there's a difference between the recommendations that are made and what people are doing. So that's part of the issue. Now, Jordan Peterson recently talked about going on an all-meat diet for a while. I'm not sure that's a great idea. And so I'm not sure, that I want to take nutrition advice from a very smart, well-trained psychologist who doesn't have training in nutrition, epidemiology, cardiovascular medicine. So I think that, that's an example of somebody who's, got some good ideas, very smart, but not necessarily giving the best advice, in my opinion.
I do think we need to take more time to help people learn how to implement what the recommendations are. I think that's a big part of it. I actually started practicing as a dietitian right when the low-fat movement came out. So you asked earlier if there was a 180 degree. That was definitely one in my career where I remember counseling people on, low fat, low fat, low fat. And I definitely do not do that anymore, in terms of it needs to be what the replacement nutrient is, looking at the totality of what they're eating. So I would definitely say I've changed that kind of concept. But I think people, just on the way here, I was sitting in the airport and eating something, and a gentleman, it was a bagel. And the gentleman was like, "Oh, I love bagels, but, they make us feel bad about everything we eat." They, I'm sure meaning the health establishment. And I think people become frustrated and don't try as much, or, you know what I'm saying? So I think we need to be better.
And particularly when the context is missing. So it's one moment carbs are bad, the next moment fats are bad. As someone who's not studying this, that has to be particularly frustrating because you're going to throw your hands up in the air and say, no one knows.
And there's definitely challenges. I think that food that is less expensive for people to purchase tend to be not great in terms of nutrition quality. So there's a lot of things. I think people like to point out one thing and say, this is why we're failing. But I think it's multifactorial and we can't just point at one thing. And I really feel like we need to do a better job at helping people be more likely to have success in changes.
And start with what they're doing and say, here's some tweaks that you can make to move in the direction of a dietary pattern that is more consistent with the recommendations. And, it's not one size fits all, and there are cultural issues and practical issues that you have to contend with. And so, helping people to move in the right direction is what we generally focus on.
Are you optimistic that improvements can be made in the quality of the average person's diet without dramatically changing the food environment? This kind of obesogenic food environment where there's just so many temptations to kind of veer off course, so to speak.
I don't know that I'm optimistic. I think it really depends on, it's so easy now for people to go to whatever grocery store and buy foods that are of low nutrition quality, but they're easy to prepare and they're less expensive. And so I think it's possible, but I just really believe you have to work with each person or create a situation, interventions, public health, whatever that might be, to help it become more reasonable for people.
And one of the challenges is you can only sell what people want, not what they need. And so partly it's educating people on nutrition and a healthy dietary pattern, not specific to heart disease or cancer or diabetes, but just what is a healthy dietary pattern, and then making recommendations for how you can take what somebody's doing and adapt it to be closer to what's recommended. And so, the challenge is if people don't know, then they're not going to want to have those foods that are going to promote a healthier diet. And, it's a chicken and egg thing. So I give this example. Taco Bell a while ago had a healthy menu, and in lots of surveys, people said, absolutely, we would love to have a healthy menu at Taco Bell. And then they put up the healthy menu and nobody bought it. And so, that's the problem. What people say they want and what they actually buy are often different things.
Perhaps if they replace some of the less healthy things with the healthy and they were no longer an option, then they would buy the healthy ones.
Yeah. I bought from the healthy menu at Taco
I did too,
Bell.
Actually. Fresca. It was the Fresca menu. But we also have to, I think, kind of what you just said, people, I think, also get caught up in, I have to be perfect at making all these healthy choices. And so helping people understand, again, going back to the what are they doing currently? Let's make some tweaks. It's not about perfection. It's about, overall, what are you choosing to eat during the day? And if you've got some, lower quality foods as snacks or at your meals, what can we swap out instead? But helping them make those swaps, becoming comfortable with those swaps, and then moving forward.
It's an interesting thing just to think at a high level as scientists here that are conducting studies. I think there's a lot of people, and probably some of them are listeners of this show, who think, do we need any more nutrition science studies? Don't we already know enough? This is not a knowledge problem. This is an implementation problem. Is that something largely you would agree with?
I think it's both. I think there are areas, as an example, the effects of diet on inflammation. That's kind of a new area that there's some research, but I think there's a lot more to do. So I think it's a combination of knowledge and implementation, but I would say that implementation is the harder part of that.
Coming back to obesity and excessive body fat, how would you explain how that affects someone's blood lipids and someone's blood glucose control? What's actually happening there inside their body?
You end up with an excess of free fatty acids that are being released from adipose tissue. The liver is being bathed in free fatty acids, and so the liver takes those free fatty acids and it makes triglycerides out of them. And so when the liver has triglycerides, there are only a few things that can be done with those triglycerides. It can break them down and burn the fatty acids for energy. It can package them into VLDL particles that are then released into the bloodstream to traffic triglycerides to other parts of the body.
Which are an ApoB containing
lipoprotein. And I'll actually circle back to that in a second. And then the third thing is it can deposit the triglyceride ectopically in the liver, but also in the periphery. So you can get fat invading other tissues. So normally our adipose stores are where we are storing triglyceride.
Under the skin.
Under the skin, so subcutaneous adipose. And so when that bucket is either full or with regard to not having the capacity that's needed for the amount of fatty acids floating around, you tend to start depositing triglyceride in other places. So in the heart, in skeletal muscle, in the pancreas, in the kidney, and so forth. And so that ectopic fat can cause metabolic dysfunction. But going back to this issue of what happens with obesity, number one, you have insulin resistance typically. Number two, you have overproduction of VLDL particles that are enriched with triglycerides. And that drives an exchange of triglycerides that come off of those VLDL particles and go on to HDL and LDL particles in exchange for cholesterol. So you end up with high triglycerides, smaller, denser HDL and LDL particles. And so we used to talk about atherogenic dyslipidemia, which was elevated triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, small, dense LDL particles. And so the other thing with insulin resistance you get is that you're overworking the pancreas because the pancreas has to put out more insulin to dispose of the glucose in the bloodstream. And over time, the pancreas kind of burns out and is no longer able to produce enough insulin to maintain normal glucose levels. So the result of that is, impaired glucose tolerance, prediabetes, and ultimately, if the dysfunction is sufficient, then you end up with type 2 diabetes. So obesity drives a lot of, really negative metabolic consequences.
Let me try and throw some of that back to you. So you started off there by talking about the subcutaneous kind of fat compartment, and we can all store a certain amount of energy there. And perhaps that's not completely benign, but it's less metabolically damaging than having fat going inside organs like the liver and the pancreas. Correct me if I get anything wrong here.
You're on target.
So as you're presumably in a calorie surplus, so you're consuming more energy than your body is utilizing over a day, over a week, over a certain period, it has to do something with that excess energy. If it can't put it into the fat compartment under our skin, and I want to come back to why and why that might be different between people, then that excess energy, ends up going through circulation, entering the liver, and then it can either be stored as fat within the liver, or it can be exported in these VLDLs, and then that, I presume that extra triglyceride, if it's traveling through circulation and there's not an energy requirement for it, that's when it ends up going into other organs,
right?
Like the pancreas.
Exactly. And so, with fat stores, so you have adipocytes, and there are two ways to deal with storing triglyceride if your fat stores are kind of full, if you will. One way is to make the fat cells bigger, and that's hypertrophy. And the other is to make more fat cells, hyperplasia. And when I was in training, we learned that, as an adult, you have a certain number of fat cells and it's not going to change. It turns out that's not really true. In fact, you can increase the number of fat cells. And so people who don't have an ability to do that as much as, say, someone else, then their fat cells sort of get full, they aren't making more of them, and you end up with ectopic deposition of triglyceride, in places where it optimally wouldn't be.
And so this is why you can have two people in front of you that are the same BMI and body fatness,
yep.
But when you look at their biomarkers, one of them has dysregulated blood glucose control, elevated triglycerides, low HDL. The other one, then they're normal,
right?
Because presumably that person has a greater capacity to store this energy fat subcutaneously. They have less of it getting stored in these organs.
Right. And there's a class of drugs, the thiazolidine diones. They're considered insulin sensitizer drugs, and pioglitazone is the one that's most commonly used. It's generic now, so you don't hear much about it. But one of the interesting things that it does is it increases the fat cells subcutaneously. And so what you get is this shift of body fat away from the places you don't want it to be, ectopic and in visceral stores around the organs, and it shifts it to subcutaneous stores. Well, that might not be great, on the beach, but metabolically, everything improves. And the more you expand those subcutaneous adipose stores with pioglitazone, the greater the metabolic benefit that you see, the more things improve in terms of risk factors. And so, that's kind of an illustration of the idea that moving fat out of one place where it's doing some mischief into another place where it's more or less being stored in a more metabolically benign way is helpful.
So that kind of brings us to the idea of metabolically healthy obesity. And my understanding of that is that can kind of exist where someone is obese and metabolically their biomarkers appear in range or normal. So they are at less risk of cardiometabolic disease than the person who's obese that has ectopic fat, high triglycerides and elevated blood glucose and all of that. But they're still at higher risk of cardiometabolic disease than someone of normal body weight.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. So, it's like any kind of situation where your, genetics and environment have an interplay. And some people, some people have obesity, but they have normal glucose, normal lipids, and so forth. Other people gain just a little bit of weight and their metabolic profile goes way out of whack. And, that's an interaction between their genetics and their environment. And, while we say that someone may be more metabolically healthy as an obese person, I wouldn't equate that with being healthy. I think there is risk in the long run, and maybe it isn't that the person's going to develop diabetes, but maybe they're going to develop arthritis. There are other issues that come along with it. elevated blood pressure, left ventricular hypertrophy. So, I think the optimal thing is to deal with the obesity. And partly, I think an important point is a push is a win when it comes to weight gain, because the average adult American's gaining more than a pound a year. So between the ages of 20 and 60, more than 40 pounds of weight gain. And so if we can, at the very least, work on changing that trajectory to make it, less weight gain, more weight stable, even if it's not, what we would consider an optimal body weight, the really important thing is to change that trajectory so the person doesn't continue to gain weight as the years go on.
And that's back to the implementation of our recommendations.
Right.
So,
and the 30-30-30 study that we're going to talk about, which kind of comes into play there. Just on this hyperplasia, the point that you made, and what was the name of that drug?
Pioglitazone.
Right. So that helps someone increase the number of fat cells in the subcutaneous fat compartment. So it kind of shuttles energy out from within the organs, ectopic fat, into this compartment under the skin. You get improvement in metabolic profile. I think some people listening might be wondering, are there known aspects of our lifestyle that can make our subcutaneous adipose compartment more functional, able to store more fat?
I was going to bring this up, like exercise is basically a great insulin sensitizer as well. And so we really should be encouraging people to, not everyone's going to be a candidate for pioglitazone. And, I always believe we should be trying with lifestyle interventions first and foremost. Pharmacotherapy is necessary, but, exercise is medicine. I think Kevin has the quote that exercise is like a 30-minute, it's like a pill.
You can think of your exercise as a pill that you have to take every day. It just takes 30 minutes to swallow.
Exactly. But, the American College of Sports Medicine has an initiative called Exercise is Medicine, because we know it can do many of the things that pharmacotherapy achieves as well.
And I would add to that a healthy dietary pattern also improves insulin sensitivity. And at kind of the root of a lot of these things that we're talking about is insulin resistance. So if you improve the insulin resistance, you get less ectopic fat deposition, triglycerides go down, the load on the pancreas is reduced. So
the insulin resistance comes before the ectopic fat?
Well, it's the answer is it might go in both directions. And so the ectopic fat may produce insulin resistance, but it may also result from insulin resistance. So if you look at adipose tissue, for instance, so what happens, you can do this experimentally. You can take a person of a, given body mass index, adipose quantity, and you can make them insulin resistant by infusing free fatty acids or infusing intralipid, which is broken down into free fatty acids. So you raise the free fatty acid level for a few hours, you've got insulin resistance. Then you can experimentally do the opposite. You can use a drug called Acipimox, which reduces the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. You infuse that for a few hours, reduce the free fatty acids, and guess what? Insulin resistance goes down, insulin sensitivity improves. And so the connection, or a big part of the connection between obesity and insulin resistance, is excess release of free fatty acids into the bloodstream. And then that leads to insulin resistance, but also contributes to this ectopic fat deposition because you have too many fatty acids to deal with metabolically, essentially. And so exercise lowers those fatty acids. And so, if somebody who is obese, exercises, especially in the evening, because it's a little complicated, but it's the late postprandial period where you see the greatest effect. But in the US, we tend to eat every couple of hours. And so you never get into that late postprandial period except overnight. So exercise improves insulin sensitivity, and that's especially true for people who exercise in the evening, which isn't perfect for everyone because some people exercise in the evening and then they can't sleep. So I don't want to suggest that, if you're exercising in the morning, that's great. But especially in the evening, that's when you see this big improvement in insulin sensitivity.
But it is possible to sort of manipulate the amount of fat that we can store subcutaneously? Or is that genetic? Is that something that's genetically determined?
Well, I think it's a combination. I don't think we have a great understanding of the degree to which lifestyle may impact that. I think that there are lifestyle and other non-genetic factors that may be important, but the question is how important, and it hasn't really been studied, to the degree that it would need to be for me to give a really definitive answer, other than I think we have pretty good evidence that people who exercise regularly have less ectopic fat deposition.
And that's mostly aerobic exercise?
I think both aerobic and resistance exercise are helpful, and both improve insulin sensitivity. And I should also point out that an exercise bout is like a pill that you take, in the sense that when you exercise, you get improved insulin sensitivity for kind of 24 to 48 hours, and then the effect kind of wears off. And so you have to keep doing it in order to have this, continuous improvement. And so if you stop doing it, just like if you stop taking your statin, your LDL cholesterol is going to go up. If you stop your exercise, then your insulin resistance is going to go up.
Yeah, I heard someone else a couple of weeks ago kind of liken it to brushing your teeth and sort of seeing it as personal hygiene.
Yeah.
You don't just brush your teeth once a week. You're doing it every single day. And
most days I do.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that we just have to help people understand, how important it is to do something every day and take away the barriers of why they're not fitting exercise into their daily routine.
Yeah. Have you guys come across the personal fat threshold?
That's new to me. No.
So I had a guest on this show, Professor Roy Taylor, who works in the UK, and he's done a bunch of essentially weight loss trials. These were very low calorie diet kind of trials with subjects that had type 2 diabetes, and they were looking at how much ectopic fat they had, and they were trying to establish how much body weight does someone have to lose on average to get below what he called a personal fat threshold, which essentially the way he described it was getting down to a level of body fatness where the metabolic profile improved. And I guess the point of me bringing this up is if someone's listening to this and thinking, this is confusing, can I change my subcutaneous fat capacity? Is the main sort of take-home point here that if you're getting blood work and your HDL's low, your triglycerides are really high, your HbA1c and fasting blood glucose are high, you have some sort of metabolic condition perhaps, that you likely have ectopic fat. And if you can lose enough body fat, you might begin to see some of those things, those markers of cardiometabolic health normalize once you get ectopic fat down below a certain amount.
Yep, I think that's true. The challenge is two things. It's hard to lose weight, and we have decades of experience now with lifestyle interventions for weight loss. And we published a paper last year where we summarized the weight loss that you see with lifestyle interventions, with intensive lifestyle interventions, with pharmacotherapy, and with metabolic surgery. And what you see essentially is that with lifestyle interventions, you're not moving the needle very much. In most studies with lifestyle interventions, the weight loss is 3-4%. And with intensive lifestyle interventions, it's more like 7 or 8%. And so for a lot of people, that's not going to be enough to get them below that threshold. And so that's the challenge, number one. The second challenge is we spend most of our lives not losing weight. And so it's about getting weight and body fat down and then keeping it down. And so these are big challenges. And I've spent over 30 years studying anti-obesity drugs. And I'd say, 25 of those years were hugely frustrating because we'd find a drug that worked reasonably well, but then it had safety issues. We'd find other drugs that didn't work very well. And then all of a sudden, we've got new agents that are effective, and they're producing, 15, 20% loss of body weight, which is enough to move the needle in terms of reducing cardiometabolic risk. And we've got, pretty good evidence for that now. And with metabolic surgery for weight loss, you see very substantial reductions in risk. So cardiovascular risk down by about 50%, cancer risk down by 30 or 40%.
This is with a GLP-1 agonist, or?
Well, this is with metabolic surgery.
With surgery.
You're getting these reductions, kidney disease reduced by 67%. So that is sort of proof of concept, if you will. And now we've got new drug agents that are producing weight loss that's in that same range. And so we're beginning to accumulate evidence of benefit, but there are also challenges with that. So the ideal thing is to prevent the obesity in the first place. Once it's present, it's difficult to manage. And for some people, they're going to need pharmacotherapy to reduce their cardiometabolic risk. But we're also very interested in how do we design better lifestyle interventions to move people from 3 or 4% weight loss to maybe 10 or 12% weight loss, where you do begin to see these metabolic benefits that Dr. Taylor is talking about.
Yeah, the GLP-1 agonist kind of story is really interesting, and it's everywhere right now. I think I read a couple of weeks ago, at least the CDC was saying that prevalence of obesity in this country for the first time has stopped increasing. Maybe
even dropped a bit.
Maybe even dropped a little bit. And is that a combination of COVID and GLP-1 agonists?
If I had to guess, I don't know, but if I had to guess, I'd say GLP-1 receptor agonists are probably the main driver of that. COVID, for a lot of people, we talk about the freshman 15 when people go off to school and they gain 15 pounds. Well, a lot of people gained weight during COVID. On the other hand, there's a subset of people who were at home and not commuting, so they had more time to work out and they improved their diet. But actually, I think if anything, COVID probably worsened the obesity problem rather than making it better.
You guys know this already. At the center of good health lies a healthy microbiome. When you feed your microbes, they reward you with drug-like compounds that improve blood sugar control, lower inflammation, act as precursors to important neurotransmitters in the brain, and plenty more. Step 1 in achieving this is a prebiotic-rich, plant-based dietary pattern. If you want to go a step further, you can add a prebiotic supplement to your diet, providing your microbes with extra fuel to grow stronger. I personally start my day with 38 Terra's Daily Microbiome Nutrition, or DMN, which I had the privilege of formulating alongside gastroenterologist Dr. Will Bolsowitz. This is hands down a best-in-market, complete prebiotic with clinically proven ingredients such as actazine and solnol that have been shown to improve gut barrier function and normalize bowel movements. It's like doing the reps in the gym, but for your gut. Get 10% off your DMN at 38terra.com using the code THEPROOF. That's 38TERA.com and use the coupon code THEPROOF for 10% off.
We're going to get to how we can improve upon dietary interventions and exercise interventions and perhaps help people lose more weight and keep it off. But while we're on GLP-1 agonists, there seems to be a few different reactions to these medications. There's one camp, I think, that looks at the track record of dietary intervention studies, weight loss studies, which you just went over, that haven't been that successful. And they look at the obesogenic environment and they think, gosh, this is all we have. So praise the Lord. There's that camp. And that camp, probably many of them think we shouldn't spend any more money on dietary intervention studies. Then there's another camp that almost has a visceral reaction to GLP-1 agonists. And I think it's, at least what I'm reading online, the line of thinking or the logic is that pharmaceutical industry, they prioritize profits before your health. You don't get a free lunch. There's got to be problems with this drug. And I see people sort of comment and say, yeah, but what about the long-term risk of cancer or dementia or these things? And at least the way that I kind of see this, but just stepping back when I look at GLP-1 agonists, and where I think some people might be making an error of judgment here is, and I just want to get your feedback on this, is that when you are thinking about, is this net positive for someone? They lose a significant amount of body weight. You can't be comparing that to this idealistic situation of that person having achieved that weight loss with diet or exercise when the interventions have been so unsuccessful. You have to ask the question, are they better off having lost 100 pounds with a GLP-1 agonist versus proceeding through the rest of their life with that same body weight on or gaining weight? Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that?
And I don't know, Carol,
well,
do you want to comment?
I mean, first and foremost, I want to say that when a person is taking a GLP-1 receptor agonist, lifestyle should still be a big part of that picture. Unfortunately, we've heard stories of where, patients receive the GLP-1 medication and aren't encouraged to address the lifestyle, but lifestyle intervention should be the foundation. And if you look at the clinical trials of these drugs, it was always on a background of an intensive lifestyle intervention. So lifestyle should continue to be part of that. And most people who are candidates for GLP-1 receptor agonists, because there's people who aren't candidates that are using these and aren't necessarily, that's not who it was created for. But people who have obesity and have struggled with weight, and many for most of their lives, that is the person where it's a tool that can be helpful for them. I still believe the lifestyle intervention should be part of it because, and we hear that some people plateau with, longer use of the GLP-1s. So you still have to help a person facilitate a healthier lifestyle regardless of whether they're on the drug or not. But I do believe that helping them reduce their excess adiposity is going to be a win. And I think we need to start, remembering people who've struggled with their weight. They've really gone through a lot. It's not like they just woke up one day and they're like, oh, well, I just want to take this drug.
And I'll say that I know plenty of people who are, physicians, PhDs, very disciplined, successful people who have struggled with their weight their whole life. And one of the interesting things I noticed at the American College of Cardiology meeting about a year and a half ago was that all of the cardiologists who I knew who were carrying some extra weight suddenly were not. And I assume that that's, GLP-1 receptor agonist. But, those are examples of people who are very knowledgeable, very disciplined, and they just couldn't control their weight. And it was important to them to do so, but they were not successful at it. So I think that the, idea that, it's just a character flaw, people just need to push away from the table and move more. I think that's not true. I think appetite is very highly regulated, and I think we don't understand the, drivers of obesity well enough now. There are strong genetic elements to it. And also, once it's present, it's very difficult to manage. So even if you have someone who maybe doesn't have a strong genetic potential, but they go through a stressful period and they gain weight, then it's hard to get that weight off and keep it off. And so to quote Lane Norton, he has an expression where he says, shoot the alligator closest to the boat. We know that obesity is associated with all of these health risks. We know that metabolic surgery for weight loss substantially reduces these health risks. So yes, do we fully understand the long-term implications of using these medications for decades? We don't, but we do understand the risks associated with obesity. And I think there's good reason to believe that these drugs are a tool in combination with lifestyle to help reduce those risks.
Right, and as you say, they're not a magic pill. They're addressing one important risk factor, but you still want to be trying to improve lifestyle to address those other risk factors you mentioned before, like blood pressure, which I guess does track a little bit with obesity, but blood lipids. You mentioned before you can be healthy body weight, but still have elevated blood lipids.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The pushback against GLP-1 agonists, and this is taking us more into a behavioral science, psychology realm. So we're taking a little sidebar moment here. So
you said you didn't do this, Simon.
Indulge me for a second here. I read something really interesting recently that Chris Williamson, who has a podcast, was speaking about. A lot of the pushback against GLP-1 agonists seems to be from thin people. And that's just an interesting little bit of psychology to think about. And his explanation was as good as I've seen anyway, that from an evolutionary kind of biology point of view, and the goal being mating, your sort of physical body composition sort of is a signal of status. And it may be that thin people are sort of exceedingly opposed to these GLP-1 agonists because they feel like they've worked hard and have a lot of discipline to achieve their level of body fatness, and see a GLP-1 agonist as kind of leveling the playing field out and creating competition from a mating point of view, which I thought was a kind of interesting explanation for why you might see so much of the kind of arguing online.
Yeah, and I think that the idea, again, that obesity is a character flaw is just simply not correct. And I think there's a lot of stigma around obesity. And I do hear a lot of thin people who maybe they've worked hard, but they haven't necessarily worked harder than someone else who has a higher body weight. But, they're judging and sort of saying it's a character flaw, and they just need to improve their lifestyle and get their weight under control. Except generally, these are people who haven't struggled with weight. So, I was obese as a child, and when I was around 15, I lost a lot of weight. And so I kind of assume I have a genetic predisposition to obesity. I'm adopted, so I don't know my biological parents and, their body habitus. But if I had to guess, I would say they were probably one or both was obese. And so, like I say, I worked very hard to maintain my squishy but stable body weight. And so, I think that there's a lack of appreciation for the biological drive. And it's sort of like breathing. So if I were to say to you, hey, just cut your breathing by about 20%, for the next 6 weeks, and then we'll evaluate you. Well, that's not going to go well because you have this strong drive to breathe. And I think that with obesity, what we're seeing with the GLP-1 receptor agonists is essentially appetite and craving control. And we sometimes refer to it as food noise. And so when people take GLP-1 receptor agonists, they frequently will say, this is the first time in my life that I haven't had constant thoughts about food. So I think it's complicated. And I'll just briefly go back to the Minnesota starvation studies done by Ansel Keys and colleagues, where they took people who were healthy young men and they put them on a weight maintenance diet for 3 months and then on a semi-starvation diet. And with the semi-starvation diet, people just didn't feel well. They had no energy. They stopped having a sex drive. They started fantasizing constantly about food and changing careers to open a restaurant or go into the catering business. They started collecting recipes. They were obsessed with food. And I think that what we're doing often with people who have obesity is we're advising them to starve themselves and putting them into a state that's similar to these starvation experiment subjects.
So a key kind of point to underscore here is that people can have varying degrees of hunger drive to eat, even though they might have the same total daily energy requirement, and that can be controlled by genes?
Yeah, I think there's a strong genetic component. One of the challenges is with certain things, you have genes that have a large effect. And so it's easy to identify those genes and understand what's going on. With obesity, I think you've got lots of genes with small effects. And so because of that, it's more difficult to identify the specific genes or combination of genes. But I also think that it's, the old expression is that when it comes to obesity, genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. And so we've got this situation where we have an obesogenic environment, and we have a certain prevalence of predisposition toward obesity in the population. And that predisposition is going to be expressed in an environment that's obesogenic.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that I've learned over the years, certainly, is I think there's this idea out there from people that are thin that on the outside they look at someone and think, well, they should just be more disciplined, but they're not appreciating that there is a biological difference in terms of drive to consume food and that noise that you speak about. And so would I be right in, can we almost think of drugs like a GLP-1 agonist kind of helping normalize that hunger?
Yep, I think of it that way. Now, in a sense, with GLP-1 receptor agonists, we're creating supraphysiologic levels of GLP-1. And so, I do think we're moving people toward a more normal level of appetite and sort of food obsession. But, I also think that lifestyle is an element of that as well. What people are eating, how much they're exercising, those also influence those drives. And so the combination is needed in some people, but in others, it's a matter of prevention, and then also a matter of, if they're going to lose weight through a lifestyle intervention, how do they maintain that weight loss? Because, lots of people say, yeah, I've lost 150 pounds. I've lost, 15 pounds 10 times, but I've gained it back each time. And so that's the big challenge, is losing weight and keeping it off. And I think a big element of that is that we're fighting a person's drive to eat. And we have this mismatch between the energy drive to eat and the energy expenditure. And when you look at that, a little more than a pound a year of weight gain over time, that's 10 or 20 calories a day difference.
Is that the hunger gap? Is that what you call
That's
the hunger gap?
Yeah.
The pair of you then, when you're thinking of the dietary interventions, and I guess this brings us to 30-30-30, you're thinking about, okay, so there's this drive to consume calories that is kind of disproportionate to the amount of energy that person needs, right?
Right.
Their body is going out and sourcing more calories than it's expending. How can we kind of pull on certain elements of nutrition and exercise to kind of close that gap down so that their drive to go out and get calories is better matched to the amount of calories that they're expending?
Right, exactly.
Okay, and that's essentially the premise of the 30-30-30 study and how you came to that framework?
Before we move on to that, I did want to go back to your point about the hypothesis of, thin people being threatened by the level playing field. I've never heard of that. I think it's an interesting hypothesis.
And let me just put my hand up and say I am not an evolutionary biologist, psychologist. I'm stepping way outside of my lane. I read it and I thought, that's interesting.
It is interesting. I think that it has more to do with people with obesity being stigmatized for a very, very long time, and that it is so easy for someone who has not struggled with weight to look at someone and judge everything they're doing or not doing and saying if they just tried harder, if they just moved more, etc. I was obese as a child as well, so I've lived it. And I think that Kevin and I come to it because of our own experience with that perspective of, how difficult it is. Behaviorally, I didn't use GLP-1s, just putting it out there. But we just have a different perspective that not everybody has, to be able to say, it's very easy to judge, but it's difficult, and it has a lot to do with, the drive for hunger, but behavioral aspects as well. Some people don't necessarily have the genetics of, like my parents were both lean. As they grew older, they were in that, gained the weight over the years. So, environment, lifestyle has a lot to do with it, but also, why are people choosing to eat? Is it stress? I mean, it's so much more complicated than people like to just say they're overweight because they're not moving enough or they're eating too much.
We did a survey 20 years ago of physicians. So at the time, the prevalence of obesity in the US was 34, 36%. It's a little bit lower than it is today. But among physicians, it was only about 8%. And so we did a survey of physicians, asked them questions. And so we didn't have too many obese physicians, but we had overweight physicians. And the strongest predictor of a physician being overweight or obese was eating when lonely or bored. And so there are things other than hunger. And so when I talk about food noise, it isn't just hunger that's driving that. Food is used, we talk about comfort food. Food is used as a stress modifier. It's, people eat for many reasons other than just hunger. But I think some people have stronger cravings. They have a stronger tendency to use food as a way to deal with stress, anxiety, and so forth than others. And so, these are some of the things that really aren't understood as well as we'd like them to be.
Do you think that kind of ties into when you look at dietary intervention studies, you see, and I mean, even if you just go online, like you'll see people that have successfully lost weight, and one person did it with a low carb diet. They're staunchly an advocate for low carb. They want everyone to do low carb. The next person tried low carb, it didn't work, and they did low fat and it worked, and they're staunchly advocating for low fat. Is that, do you think, explained by genetics and biology, cravings for certain foods, or is it more of a behavioral type of explanation?
It's probably a combination, in my opinion.
Yep, I agree completely. And just as an example, when we look at acute satiety promotion, you have protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Protein is typically the most satiating, fat the next, and carbohydrate the least. But that's not true for everybody. So as an example, for me, fat is more satiating than protein. I don't know why. I don't understand the physiology, but I can, reproduce it in blind, N of 1 studies that I do on myself, with the cooperation of my wife, who, helps me with these sometimes. And so, I think there is genetically driven variation. And I think also there are psychological factors. So as an example, we know that when you look at weight loss programs, so one of my colleagues at Indiana University looks at adverse childhood experiences. And, they strongly predict, more adverse childhood experiences strongly predict success with a weight loss program. And I should say, inversely predict more adverse experiences, people lose less weight on a weight loss program. And so I think there are a lot of factors that we don't fully understand. Part of it is cravings and hunger. Part of it is other reasons that people are consuming food. And it's a combination. Okay,
so 30, 30, 30. I've mentioned it a few times. People are probably thinking, what the hell are they talking about by this point? So what is the 30, 30, 30 study that you're planning? And then perhaps we can jump in and talk to the specific elements of this framework that, as we just mentioned, are kind of aimed at reducing that hunger gap and I guess essentially making it easier for people to lose weight and keep it off.
And kind of going back to the implementation part of it. So as we've mentioned several times now, lifestyle change is difficult, and some people do really well for a little bit, but then wane at their motivation or life happens or whatever. So trying to come up with something that is simple for them to follow, definitely based on evidence that we have from studies that show we can help people with satiety through what they're choosing to eat, Obviously, lots of evidence about the benefits of exercise, some of what we've talked about already today. So it's really looking at a program that was Kevin's idea, and he can share his other acronym that he shares, but I can never remember. But 30-30-30 is way easier. So 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber per day, and 30 minutes of exercise per day is our 30-30-30.
I love that you chose 3 things that I think are the least controversial of, I mean, there's still controversy probably in certain
I'm sure there is.
extreme ends of the nutrition world, maybe in the fiber element. There's carnivores saying you don't need any fiber, and there's probably some people that are staunchly opposed to protein, but
Yes.
generally most people would agree getting enough protein in the diet, enough fiber, and exercise are three kind of good first steps.
Yes.
And the idea is to deal with both sides of the energy balance equation. And so we've got pretty good evidence that higher protein in a meal will produce satiation, and then satiety lasts a longer period of time. So you feel full longer.
Can we just quickly define satiety, satiation, and hunger? Because I know we're throwing those around.
Right. And these are they're related, but different concepts. So satiety is sort of a feeling of fullness. You've eaten enough. So satiation is the process of moving from, wanting to eat to feeling full. Satiety is sort of how long that lasts. Hunger is that you have a physiological drive to eat. I want food now. So when we do studies to look at appetite, we ask 4 questions. We ask, how full do you feel? How hungry do you feel? What is your desire to eat? And then if you were to eat now, how much do you think you would eat? Prospective consumption. And these are related concepts, but people who really specialize in this area will tell you that they're not identical, and you can have situations where you have desire to eat, but you're not really hungry. You can have other situations where you have a feeling of fullness, and it's not connected exactly to hunger or desire to eat. So, they are related, but most people understand, kind of the physiological sensation of hunger. And most people also understand that desire to eat is not always connected to hunger. So the old, example of that is, there's always room for pie,
Yeah, it happens to me every night.
Yeah.
If I'm on the couch watching Netflix,
Right.
I've eaten enough food, I'm not hungry, but for whatever reason, I'll go to the kitchen and grab something else to eat.
Exactly. And, after 4 p.m., average American consumes more than 50% of their calories after 4 p.m. So they tend to graze through the evening. So it's not because they're ravenously hungry after 4 p.m. It's because they're lonely, bored.
Watching TV.
You're watching TV and something to do with your hands.
Right, exactly.
So,
And it becomes a habit, a routine.
a routine. So with protein, there's an interesting relationship of protein to hunger and fullness. And what we've found, and not everybody agrees with this, so I have to say that, very well-known people in the field, say, no, you're full of it.
I just wrote down Barbara Rolls.
Yep.
So we'll come back.
So actually, this is going to be very much related to the fiber component especially. But with protein, what we found is that if you add protein in exchange for carbohydrate in a meal, you will get more satiation and greater satiety, less hunger.
Is that any type of carbohydrate or refined carbs?
It seems to be any kind of carbohydrate, but it's tied into the fiber component, so it's a little bit complicated. But for the most part, the studies are generally replacing refined carbohydrate starches and sugars with protein. And what we found is that under 20 grams in a meal doesn't move the needle at all. When you get beyond 20 grams, you start to see this satiating effect. And when you get beyond 30 grams, it's always there. And it doesn't really seem to be related to the person's body weight. I would have expected that maybe a person who's 240 pounds would require 40 grams of protein, whereas somebody who's 120 pounds maybe requires only 15 grams of protein. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen that we always see the effect when we get to 30 grams of protein or
So
more.
there's some type of nutrient sensing that's independent of your body weight.
Yes. So that seems to be the case, at least based on the studies that we've done. So when you replace carbohydrate with protein, you get more satiety. And so that's part of the story. And the question is why? Well, Arne Astrup and colleagues in Scandinavia, they have done studies on this, and they show this dose-response effect. When you increase protein as an exchange for carbohydrate, you get a higher GLP-1 response. And then there's an interesting thing, which is that the L cells in the small intestine are not evenly distributed. And so you have more of them later on in the small intestine. And so if you can delay protein digestion until later in the small intestine, that seems to help increase that GLP-1 response. Now, GLP-1 is complicated because we know with GLP-1 receptor agonists, you're talking about supraphysiologic levels. But then there's a class of drugs called the DPP-4 inhibitors, and they basically just slow down the breakdown of GLP-1.
Is that acarbose or is that?
No, acarbose is an alpha-glucosidase inhibitor. Yeah. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, let's come back to that, because now that you're talking about protein getting to the end of the small intestine, thinking about ways to slow down digestion.
Yeah, exactly. So GLP-1 is released. These L cells are releasing GLP-1, but GLP-1 has like a 2-minute half-life, and it's mostly having effects locally. But there's a lot of connection between the gut and the brain. So you release GLP-1, that stimulates the vagus nerve, sends signals up to the brain, and then you actually release GLP-1 in the brain. But of course, that's hard to study in humans, hard to get people to volunteer for, brain biopsies and such. So,
which presumably then dampens the drive to eat.
Right.
Dampens the drive to eat. And that's what Arne Astrup and others have shown, that you get this larger GLP-1 response. You also have GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, also known as gastric inhibitory peptide. And
I won't ask you to spell that one.
Yeah, GLP-1, GIP response go up with more protein. So I think we have, reasonable evidence to support that view, even though not everyone agrees with it. And so with more protein in a meal, you get more satiety, but you have to get to 30 grams of protein to consistently see that effect.
So you got to get to 30 grams, and then it's improved if you are able to slow down gastric emptying?
Yes. So, slow down digestion of the protein. And so that's where some of the fiber comes in. So as an example, viscous fibers, like what you get in, viscous fibers that you might take as a laxative.
Like a psyllium husk or something.
Psyllium husk. I try not to use, brand names, but I'll say the brand name Metamucil that most people are familiar with. And so that creates a gel in the intestine. And so it slows down digestion because it protects the food from digestive enzymes. It just creates a barrier, and they don't digest as quickly. And so it slows down digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. And so then you digest the proteins more slowly, you get more protein reaching those L cells, and a higher GLP-1 response. That's a hypothesis. And then there's another element to it, which is for fat, which stimulates CCK release. CCK is a protein that slows gastric emptying. There's also a hypothesis that when you have viscous fiber in combination with fat, that is causing the fat to be in contact with the intestinal wall longer and gives you a higher CCK response, which slows gastric emptying. So protein and fiber may be synergistic in terms of helping to control appetite. And then there are other things as well that we can talk about separately, which is they also affect the other side of the energy balance equation, energy expenditure.
Let's make sure we get to that. I think it was on our Zoom call that we did. That was the first time I'd heard anyone talk about this interaction between protein and fiber in the same meal with regards to how it affects appetite.
Right. And I will say that we need a lot more studies. So these are hypotheses. They're somewhat supported by the studies that we've done, but we need a lot more to be more confident that this is really happening.
What does that look like from a food point of view perspective? If someone's listening and thinking, okay, I've got a good idea what 30 grams of protein looks like, and then the 30 grams of fiber, I'm presuming, is not per meal. That's across a day.
That's across a day.
Let's make that clear.
Yeah.
I was like, I thought I said day. Yeah, but definitely a day.
There's you mentioned there, there's viscous fiber. Fiber is an umbrella term, although sometimes it could be confused for a single thing. There's lots of different types of fiber:
Right.
viscous, non-viscous, fermentable, non-fermentable. Is the simple guide of just getting 30 grams from a variety of plants, is that enough to sort of satisfy the body's requirement for viscous fiber and these different types, or does the individual need to be a little more specific and perhaps including certain foods?
That would take the simplicity away, Simon.
It would.
So we're trying to make
it would
this...
be the next step underneath the 30-30-30 framework.
And honestly, like 30, 42, 30, that's just, people don't have a hard time with that. So 30, 30, 30 is a simplification. We like to make it as simple as is practical.
Right.
And I should also say for each of these, it's at least 30 grams of protein per meal, at least 30 grams of fiber per day, at least 30 minutes of exercise per day.
But you're right. The protein part, I think it will be fairly simple, although I think some people would struggle as well. So giving them options in terms of a protein supplement or something like that. But I think with fiber, just getting people to consume higher fiber foods is going to be important. And we're considering, maybe we do consider a fiber supplement to get them to the 30 gram minimum.
And in particular, I mean, there are several foods like oats and barley, for instance, that have viscous fiber. But, to get the amounts of fiber that we're talking about is a bit of a challenge. It can certainly be done with food alone, but I think supplementation with something like Metamucil, as an example, might be helpful as well, just to make it more practical to do.
What do you think is better in terms of hunger? I guess what we're thinking about here is the kind of outcome of interest. Psyllium husk, methyl cellulose, guar gum. There's a few different options out there. Is there any kind of clear winner when it comes to the research?
Well, they have differences. So methyl cellulose and hydroxypropylmethylcellulose, they are very viscous, but they're not fermentable. Psyllium husk is very viscous, not very fermentable. Guar, on the other hand, is viscous and fermentable. And then you've got some other fibers, pectin and acacia gum. So pectin is more similar to guar. Acacia gum is not very viscous, but very fermentable. So optimally, I'd like to see people getting enough viscous fiber and enough fermentable fiber, because fermentable fibers have other effects metabolically that I think are important. And so we want to see a balance between viscous and fermentable. And, again, we want to try and simplify it. So in our study, it'll probably be, lists of foods with sort of, fiber per serving, and saying, choose one from column A, choose one from column B, etc.
With the option of a supplement, perhaps.
Right.
So on that fermentable piece, I think something that we also spoke about was on our Zoom call was that as people age, LDL cholesterol tends to go up, ApoB tends to go up, and you had some thoughts that perhaps this is explained by a reduction in propionate, a short-chain fatty acid,
Right.
if I recall correctly.
Yep.
So am I right in thinking here that your hypothesis is that a fermentable fiber might increase propionate and then through that help reduce cholesterol?
So that's one element of it. So Fermentable fibers will be fermented down to short-chain fatty acids, and they're absorbed. Now, part of it is some short-chain fatty acids will go into the intestinal cells and be used for energy there. Others will be absorbed into the circulation, and acetate and propionate both affect cholesterol metabolism. And so acetate, see if I can remember correctly, acetate stimulates cholesterol synthesis. Propionate inhibits the effect of acetate to stimulate cholesterol synthesis. And so as people age, their gut microflora changes and they produce less propionate, and so they have less of the inhibition of the effect of acetate to increase cholesterol synthesis. So by consuming more fermentable fiber, you both increase the gut microflora that are involved in fermentation, and then you're also increasing the production of propionate, which may be helpful for cholesterol metabolism. Now, having said that, it's not a huge effect. So I think some of the other effects of short-chain fatty acids are more metabolically important. Two are when you get short-chain fatty acid release, you seem to have stimulation of brown fat that increases energy expenditure. And then you also have inhibition of lipolysis in fat cells. So you reduce the release of free fatty acids. And so if you consume a fermentable fiber in the evening, you'll have lower levels of free fatty acids overnight, and that will tend to increase insulin sensitivity in the morning.
And so you could achieve that through food or a supplement like guar gum?
Yep.
Interesting. The other fiber or prebiotic that you mentioned was beta-glucans.
So beta-glucan, which is in oats and barley and some other things, is both viscous and fermentable. And so I really like beta-glucan because it has both of those properties. And so it helps to slow down digestion of starches and proteins. And then in addition to that, it's fermentable. And so you get this short-chain fatty acid release. So I'm a big fan of beta-glucan. Also, we've done a lot of studies with beta-glucan. And so with viscous fibers, they lower cholesterol levels, and we know how that works. Mainly, it's by trapping cholesterol and bile acids in the intestine and carrying them out. Bile acids are made from cholesterol, so if you carry them out, they don't get reabsorbed and recirculated, so you have to make more, and so that takes cholesterol. And then, of course, cholesterol, if you carry that out, less of it gets absorbed, and only about 10% of the cholesterol that goes through the gut every day comes from the diet. Most of it comes endogenously, and it's, dumped into the small intestine in bile. And so you have free cholesterol that's dumped in, it's reabsorbed. And so if you can prevent some of that, you can reduce cholesterol levels. So it acts in a way similar to the drug ezetimibe, which is a cholesterol absorption inhibitor, and similar to bile acid sequestrants.
Got you. So the fiber sort of carries out some of the cholesterol that's in the intestine.
Right.
And the body's response to that is the liver, we need more cholesterol. Let's pull it in out of the blood.
Pull it in out of the blood. We need more.
Create more bile, and in doing that, LDL cholesterol comes down
Exactly
in the blood. Okay, cool. So that's fiber, 30 grams per day, and that can be achieved through food alone or food plus supplements. Some of these viscous and fermentable fibers might be the best option from a supplement point of view. Is there any, and actually I know there is, because I think I read a paper of yours on this, if someone was to increase their fiber intake by 5 grams, 10 grams a day, what kind of effect could that have on their risk of developing a disease like atherosclerosis? Can we quantify that?
I'm not sure we can quantify it right now, but we can talk about effects on risk factors. So if you consume viscous fiber with a meal, you reduce the glycemic load of the meal. You do something similar to changing the meal from a high glycemic index to a low glycemic index by slowing down the digestion and absorption. So that's an element of it. And reducing glycemic load, we know, is associated with less risk for developing diabetes. Then also you lower cholesterol levels. And so we know that lowering cholesterol levels reduces the risk. And when I say cholesterol, that's a surrogate really for ApoB lipoproteins. And so Dr. Lipid, Tom Dayspring, he's absolutely right. And we should be focusing on atherogenic particles, the ApoB lipoproteins. And so viscous fiber lowers those. And so there are effects that on risk factors. Also, by reducing the insulin response, one of the things that insulin does is it causes reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys. And so by reducing the insulin response, that also has favorable effects on blood pressure. Not necessarily, in everybody, and it's not a huge effect, but you're affecting multiple risk factors in ways that you would expect to be favorable.
And so the net effect, which is hard to quantify, is a kind of stacking of all of those individual benefits.
Exactly.
That someone's getting. Back to protein for a second. You mentioned isolated, like a protein supplement. And now that you talk about slowing down the kind of rate of digestion, this gets me thinking about protein supplements and isolated proteins, and whether are they similar to a refined carbohydrate, where if you're ingesting a protein shake, there's no food matrix as such, or it's a different food matrix, I should say, that those amino acids are just going to be rapidly absorbed into circulation and have much less effect on hunger potentially than if you're getting that protein with fiber and in a food that is digested much slower?
Well, so this is the whey versus casein question. So whey is very rapidly digested, and so you see this big spike in amino acids and they come down more quickly. With casein, it's more slowly digested, and so you see this more gradual rise and fall in amino acids. And, in particular, certain amino acids are more key with regard to stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And so that's what people are usually interested in when they're doing those kinds of studies. And so when it comes to appetite, I don't think we have a great understanding of this. But the one thing we do have a reasonably good understanding of is you've got more of these L cells down lower in the small intestine. So if you digest your protein very quickly and you absorb all the amino acids, and then you get down to where a lot of the L cells are, then you don't have the amino acids and the peptides that are released with protein digestion to stimulate those L cells. So I do think that when people are taking protein supplements, that at least theoretically it might be better to consume them, say, with a viscous fiber, at least when it comes to appetite. Now, when it comes to muscle protein synthesis, now that's a different question, and it's kind of not my main area of expertise. But, I think there is a lot of information that we need to learn about timing. And I think the current U.S. diet is very low in fiber, very high in rapidly digestible sources of carbohydrate and protein. And so, we're probably not utilizing our intestines in the way that they sort of evolved to be utilized. Because if you look at hunter-gatherer types of diets, they're very high in fiber, high in protein as well. And right. So, maybe
we're making it harder for ourselves.
Maybe that we're adapted to a different kind of diet than the average American is eating now.
Right. So the idea being when you're consuming a lot of these more refined foods, that appetite dysregulation is more likely to occur, where you get that hunger gap.
Yeah, and another element of that is speed of eating. So it takes some time for these mechanisms to kick in and produce satiety. And so when you gobble down a meal in 10 minutes, you still want more because those mechanisms haven't kicked in. And so slowing down is one thing, and then adding more volume to the meal. So Barbara Rolls, volumetrics, has this idea that energy density is important. I think she's right about that. And so if we consume foods that have higher fiber content, they will have lower energy density. It will take longer to consume them. And so I think a lot of these things work together. And so when we talk about protein, fiber, and exercise, on the protein, there are effects on appetite. On the fiber, there are effects on appetite, and I think there is an interaction there. But also with the fiber, you're reducing energy density, which is the number of calories per, say, 100 grams of food consumed. And so you get that volume effect as well. So I think all of those things are contributing to the hypothesized benefits. Again, we're in the planning stages of the study. We haven't done the study yet, but we expect that based on the evidence we have, we're optimistic that we'll have better results.
It's not like you've plucked these things out of thin air. There's a body of evidence that's informed this intervention that you've put together. The simple framework, 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber per day, 30 minutes of exercise per day. There's some more details that we might get into if we have time. But while we're on Barbara Rolls, her book Volumetrics is a book that I recommend all the time. I think it's a great read. If she was sitting here, and I'm not 100% sure what her position is on protein now, but I see people citing one of her studies. Garth Davis, Dr. Garth Davis, who I enjoy his content online, he often cites her work and says, she conducted a study where participants, I think it was healthy women, we've spoken about it, so I think you're familiar with this paper, where they kind of hid varying amounts of protein in these meals and fed, a meal that had 5% protein or 10%, 15, 20, 25%, I think, to the subjects without them knowing how much protein was in the meals, and then was recording how many, because they told them just to eat until you're satisfied, and they tracked their calories they ate across the day. So they're tracking total amount of energy they consumed, and then like hunger and satiety. And that study, at least what they reported, was there was no significant difference in satiety or hunger, despite these varying sort of amounts of protein in these meals that subjects were unaware of. And so people point to that and say, see, protein doesn't really make much of a difference.
And what I would say is a couple of things. One is, it seems to be a bit of a threshold effect, and maybe the threshold differs from person to person a bit, but again, we see it every time we've gone to at least 30 grams of protein in a meal. And then the second thing is that I think I described a study that we did. We were looking at an intervention that had an impact on satiety, and we did the intervention. I can't talk about exactly what it was. Did the intervention, and at lunch, so people felt more full before lunch. At lunch, they consumed fewer calories. It wasn't a huge amount. It was, say 64 calories or something like that. And then lo and behold, at dinner, the people who got the intervention consumed exactly 64 calories more at dinner. They completely compensated for it at the next meal. So I think that there are a lot of variables, and in any one study, you can only control a certain number of them. We do have evidence that in weight loss trials, those with higher protein, people tend to lose more weight. It's not a huge effect, but it's there. With higher fiber, people tend to lose more weight, and meta-analyses have shown this. And so what we're saying is we're going to combine two things that have been associated with more weight loss, and then exercise has been associated with more weight loss. We're going to combine three things that are associated with more weight loss, hoping that by dealing with both sides of the energy balance equation, intake by influencing appetite and expenditure through exercise, but there are also effects of protein and fiber on energy expenditure, which I can go into a bit. We're going to be dealing with both sides of that energy balance equation and narrow that gap between the hunger that's driving you to eat a certain number of calories and the energy expended.
You're hoping to conduct this study in a group of participants, I think, who have prediabetes or type 2?
We're working on the entry criteria. So generally, we've studied people who are at risk for type 2 diabetes. So they don't have diabetes, they have either prediabetes or metabolic syndrome. That may be where we start here, or we might be broader and just say that a person has to have a body mass index, say between 27 and 39.9.
And what are you hoping to compare that to? I think probably a lot of people listening will be thinking, is that going to be compared against some shoddy diet, or is it going to be compared against a high quality low carb diet or a high quality low fat diet?
The idea is to use a program that's been used in other clinical trials. And one of the keys is you have to make sure that the quality of the intervention is the same for both. Mm-hmm. So you need, skilled counselors counseling, the one group and the other group. And so that you don't have the Hawthorne effect, which is that if you give more attention to one group, they're likely to do better. So you need skilled counselors doing both. We plan to use a plan that's been used in, say, pharmaceutical trials, where everyone gets a lifestyle intervention, half get placebo, half get a drug. So in this case, everyone gets a lifestyle intervention, but it'll be a standard intervention that uses the recommendations from societies like the Obesity Medicine Society, as compared to something that's similar but has this 30-30-30 component.
All right, before we click a little bit on exercise and sort of better understand how that's affecting this hunger gap, let's summarize some of the food things that we've spoken about. Starting with protein, so it was 30 grams of protein per meal. What we didn't speak about was, is there any recommendation for protein source? I know in some of your articles you've written about leaning towards more plant protein over animal protein. Does this make a difference in terms of someone's caloric intake, or I guess what's the rationale for that recommendation if it exists at all?
So I don't know if Carol, you want to
Well, I was going to
here?
mention earlier what we are going to, especially in terms of making sure each intervention is similar. Each intervention group will have like food lists, menus. We will be providing some of the food. But I think it's important, as we've been discussing throughout the podcast, individualization. So really, I think, and one thing I want to make sure I mention is that as we're helping people implement this intervention, you have to think about what is going to be changing in what they're going to be eating. So I think because we'll have that control group, we hopefully will be able to say, both intervention groups will probably have improvement in the quality of the foods that they're choosing and the, choices that they're making and that type of thing. So making sure that we provide that education for improving the quality of the diet in both groups. And then we can kind of look at the protein, fiber, exercise aspect of it. But I think it's going to be important. Like, I have different food preferences than, say, Kevin. So that's obviously going to be something that we want to consider when we implement the study to make sure that people are, one, I think we are limiting if people are on an extreme kind of dietary pattern. So if they're vegan, correct me if I'm wrong, but vegan, or if they're following something like a ketogenic diet, they will be excluded, because that makes it more difficult and to follow the dietary plan that we'll have them do.
And I would say metabolically, so when we're talking about appetite, we don't have that much information about different types of protein and their effects on appetite. If I were to summarize what we know, or at least my reading of the literature, there does not seem to be a clear advantage of one protein source over another. It seems to be more the quantity of the protein, with the caveat that there is an element of quality of protein as well. So if you're combining plant proteins to have similar protein quality, I think it's more about the quantity than the protein source. Now, protein in terms of effects on lipids, for instance, metabolically, protein has a favorable effect on lipids. If you replace carbohydrate with protein, you lower triglycerides and you lower LDL cholesterol.
What's the mechanism for that?
That's uncertain, but the OmniHeart study is the sort of prototypical study that showed this. They took, essentially a low saturated fat diet that was high in carbohydrate, and then they compared it to a similar diet where 10% of the energy was replaced with either protein or with unsaturated fats. And the best lipid profile was produced by the protein replacement of 10% of energy. And so this is underappreciated, that protein has favorable effects on the lipid profile. The source of protein does seem to matter there. The reduction in LDL cholesterol seems to be more with plant proteins as compared to animal proteins. Mechanistically, don't know why exactly. We did a study with soy protein, and we compared it to milk proteins, and we confirmed that the soy protein had a larger effect.
Is this because of other compounds that are coming along for the ride rather than the amino acids themselves?
Well, maybe. So this was soy protein that was low in isoflavones, so it wasn't that. And our hypothesis was that the soy protein would bind bile acids and increase bile acid excretion. Well, that didn't happen at all. There was zero. So we know that there's an additional effect of the plant protein, in that case soy, as compared to milk proteins, but we don't know how it's working. So there's a lot to learn there. But when it comes to appetite, it seems to be more about, if you have a high quality protein, it's more about the quantity than it is the protein source.
So getting to 30 grams in a meal being the most important sort of factor. That's the threshold that you were talking about earlier,
right?
Where you do see a significant effect on calorie consumption and hunger.
Right.
Okay. And we should just underscore that, to my understanding, based on emails we've had, the 30-30 framework, 30-30-30 framework, that's the simplified kind of way that you're going to communicate this, but there are dietary recommendations underneath that. And I wrote down from your email, recommendations to replace saturated fat-rich foods with unsaturated fat-rich foods, increasing consumption of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes, while minimizing intakes of refined starches, added sugars, and salt.
All right on. And so, my joke is that the stock symbol for Pfizer is PFE. And so what we say is you want to stay off of Pfizer's products, then add more protein, fiber, and exercise to your diet. But it's a little more complicated than that, because what we're really trying to do is protein, fiber, exercise, reduce glycemic load, and then increase unsaturated fatty acids. But FIGALUFA just doesn't have the same appeal.
That's the acronym I was mentioning earlier.
Can I assume that Pfizer are not funding this trial?
Pfizer is not funding the trial. And in Pfizer, I hope they don't, send me a cease and desist letter and tell me I should stop using that acronym.
So generally, we spoke about saturated fat earlier. So general rule of thumb, swapping saturated fats for unsaturated fats, favorable from a cardiometabolic point of view. But one thing that we have spoken about previously off air are that your views on dairy and dairy fats may have evolved a little bit over the years. So if someone's kind of listening to this and thinking, okay, I'm going to reduce my saturated fats, what foods that are rich in saturated fats should they maybe think about limiting, and which foods that contain saturated fats are maybe not so much of a problem?
Well, I think the easiest ones in terms of reducing saturated fat are what you use in cooking. So Kevin's tattoo that we talked about earlier, non-tropical oils are what we want people to be using to prepare foods. So if someone's using butter in cooking, if they're using coconut oil in cooking, then reducing their use of those types of solid fats and using the non-tropical oils instead. So those are kind of the easy things to think about. It goes back to the
Do you have a preference for olive oil and say canola oil that are rich in monounsaturated fats versus some of the other oils that are lower in monounsaturated fats and higher in polyunsaturated fats?
Personally, I don't. I think that unsaturated fats in general, mono or poly, have favorable metabolic effects, favorable effects on appetite, at least when you compare them to things like refined starches and added sugars. And so, I am more or less of the opinion that people should, use what they like. Mm-hmm. But a second element of reducing saturated fat is high-fat processed meats. It's a big source of saturated fat, so sausage and salami and so forth. And so, favoring unprocessed meats, whether that be, poultry or red meat, we counsel people to emphasize unprocessed sources of meat.
If you look at the dietary guidelines for Americans, there was actually a nice image in the 2020 to 2025 publication that shows the top sources of saturated fat that people are consuming. And sandwiches and desserts are the top. So, think about what people put on sandwiches is processed meats, cheeses. Although I think we're going to talk about dairy, where we do see some evidence that fermented dairy foods like cheese actually can have a lowering LDL cholesterol effect compared to other high saturated fat foods. So, it's, again, what you're comparing it to. But, again, going back to identifying what people are consuming, helping them figure out which foods are higher in saturated fat, whether it's in the cooking fats that they're using or the foods that they're consuming, and then swap those out.
But that's a good point, that just that simple question of where are most saturated fats in the diet coming from? Because immediately you might sort of just be led to believe that it's coming from unprocessed red meat. But what you're saying is there's other foods that are at the top of the list that are really driving a lot of the saturated fat.
It's the combination food. So desserts, think about what desserts are made with in terms of the saturated fat, the fats that they're being prepared with. So it's the combination foods or baked
So what are you
foods.
looking for then when you're at the supermarket, given we've got the 4 white poisons and someone's trying to reduce their exposure to saturated fat? What are you thinking, like when you're in the grocery store?
Well, I eat kind of simply, so I think that's where I eat kind of how I want people to eat, and shopping the perimeter, all of that stuff that you hear, and trying to choose fruits, vegetables first more often. The fermented dairy that we like, Greek yogurt is my breakfast. So I think it's like trying to figure out at the grocery store what does fit into what we see with dietary patterns that are associated with better cardiometabolic health. So getting away from the processed foods, not that people can never eat them. So going back to that whole, you don't have to be perfect, but trying to limit how much of those already prepackaged foods they're buying. And it may take a little bit more work to prepare the foods at home, but figuring out how to utilize the foods that are less processed, that are easy to make, especially if someone has, challenges with 2 jobs or whatnot, but figuring out how they can implement those. So,
I would say, we go back to this whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, non-tropical oils. So whole grains, especially cereal fibers, so whole grain breads, breakfast cereal can be a great source of fiber and whole grains. When I eat breakfast cereal, I mix usually half cereal with half chopped nuts. So that adds the nuts in. Fruits and vegetables, I try and eat a variety of fruits and vegetables on the fruit side, lots of berries, lots of citrus, and so forth. Then, I try to add nuts to lots of things and nut butters to lots of things. And then, as Carol mentioned, fermented dairy is associated with metabolic benefits. And so a lot of yogurt. The key with yogurt is to have the unsweetened yogurt. And you can add a little bit of honey or a little bit of, jelly or preserves or something to get a little bit of sweetness. But,
if someone's eating yogurt, opt for the full fat version that doesn't have the added sugars. And potentially, I think you mentioned Greek yogurt, which then you're getting the added benefit of protein as well.
Yeah, and as far as dairy fat goes, dairy fat's a little complex because it does have a fair amount of saturated fat, but it's also got these other fats in it, which are odd chain carbon or odd carbon chain fats that may have some benefits. And so, it's a little less straightforward. And so, some of my good friends and colleagues say, no, we've got to really emphasize non-fat, low-fat dairy. I used to do that. I don't do that so much anymore because the studies that we've done with full-fat dairy have not shown any worsening of the metabolic profile. And I like getting these fatty acids that may have some metabolic benefits.
Well, and again, I think it goes back to how much full-fat dairy is a person eating in a day. If they're having 1 cup of milk with their coffee in the morning, to me, that's less of a concern than if they're, over-consuming saturated fat from sandwiches and desserts, like the figure and the
frozen pizza.
Right, exactly. So,
and
I'd rather have someone drink whole-fat dairy than eat a frozen pizza. So, in terms of the overall nutrition quality. So, I think that's important. If somebody's over-consuming full-fat dairy and going over their saturated fat intake goal for the day, then that's a conversation to have. But, if I'm having 1 cup of full-fat Greek yogurt at breakfast, I don't think that's in the big picture. And if we're looking at the totality of what a person's consuming, I'm going to be less concerned about that.
This is one of those areas of nutrition where I think many in the general public think nutrition science has kind of flip-flopped. We were talking about it earlier. There was that big low-fat messaging, and now they're hearing that maybe that doesn't matter so much with their milk. And I guess I would just encourage people to appreciate that the fact that science is evolving and it can be a change in position is a good thing.
It is. The more we learn, the old expression, I think this is attributed to John Maynard Keynes. I'm not sure if it was him originally, but a reporter asked him, well, you said this and now you're saying that. And he said, well, when the data change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And so as the information we have evolves, we have to change our views and our recommendations.
And I was smiling when you said odd chain saturated fats because Carol and I were trading a few emails. There's been a lot of hype about C15 recently, and some companies like selling it in supplement form. Other than what you just mentioned there, that there may be some benefits to odd chain fatty acids, is there a lot that we can say at this point in time about fats like C15 or C17 that are saturated fats, but they're odd chain, with regards to them being essential or non-essential, and whether we should be supplementing with them, things like that?
From my recollection, what we have in terms of evidence is observational. So we have to, again, consider the limitations of that. But there is observational evidence that both C15 and C17 are associated with benefit. But I don't know of any randomized controlled trials.
Very minimal, small randomized controlled trials at this point. And so, I'm not ready to say, let's start supplementing with these, but I am of the view that whereas in the past I might be more focused on low-fat, non-fat dairy, now my recommendation is most people don't get the recommended 3 servings a day of dairy. And what I say is get your 3 servings. It's, if you want to include some full-fat dairy, that's fine. I don't think that the evidence from the studies that we've done would suggest that that's going to have any adverse effect on the metabolic profile.
And my concern with the supplement, I guess, and this is with any supplement, but the synergy that you're losing. If you're isolating C15, that's typically people are consuming from dairy, what are you missing by isolating that supplement? So we don't know that yet.
We kind of touched earlier on carbohydrate restriction and blood glucose control. Within this framework, it seems like the emphasis is more on carbohydrate quality, so getting enough fiber, and then the minimization of refined carbohydrates as opposed to carb restriction across the board per se. And there might be some people listening who are thinking, isn't it just well established that if someone has poor metabolic health, they should be restricting their total carbohydrate intake. Why is that not part of this model? I know, Carol, you've written a number of reviews on low carb diets. What does the evidence, I guess, tell us with regards to the efficacy of low carbohydrate diets or carb restriction and one's metabolic health and ability to kind of lose weight and keep it off?
Well, and Kevin was a co-author on all of those review papers, but what we do see, and this is consistent across the studies, and we wrote our scientific statement in 2019, so it's starting to get a little bit dated, but we actually had our colleague, Dan Soffer, ask if we should do an update, and I had done a couple of other presentations, and we'd written another editorial, and really the evidence is still the same, in my opinion, as it was in 2019. In that when you are looking at very low carbohydrate dietary patterns in the short term compared to higher carbohydrate, in the short term, they do tend to do better in terms of body weight loss, glycemic control. Over time, those two parameters tend to wane. So by 6 months, you start seeing that they look closer to a higher carb intake. And by 12 months, usually there's no significant difference between the two.
Is that an adherence problem, do you think?
Yes, I was going to get there. Triglycerides tend to continue to stay lower with lower carb intake. And glycemic control does actually start to wane in most meta-analyses. And a couple out there, it does show that continues to see a small, significant difference between a low carb, which isn't ketogenic anymore. So typically people can only maintain a ketogenic low carb intake for the first 3 months. Past that, the adherence issue really does become what causes the differences to
there
change.
Might be people shouting right now saying,
yes,
that wasn't
I'm
a
sure
ketogenic diet, but then the issue is, well, they couldn't maintain that diet.
And I really want to emphasize that you see benefit. We are not against carbohydrate restriction to a certain point. There are people who have cardiometabolic issues that do better with lower carb intake. It just does not have to be to the level of promoting ketosis. So, Kevin talked about Predimed and CardioPrev earlier. Those are two Mediterranean dietary patterns, both of which had about 40% of the total calories coming from carb. Both showed benefit in terms of cardiovascular disease benefits. So and that's more sustainable. So I think it's back to the personalization. People who have cardiometabolic issues do better with lower carb. It just doesn't have to be so severe that they struggle with long-term adherence.
And I would point out the observational evidence that we have to be, a bit careful about. But the observational evidence suggests that when you get below about 40% of energy from carbohydrate or a very high carbohydrate diet, outcomes look worse. And so you have higher mortality with very low and very high carbohydrate diets. So in that sort of range of 40 to 60% of energy from carbohydrate, that seems to be where you see the most benefits. And I think when you get to a very low carbohydrate diet, it's difficult to have a balanced diet where you're getting, adequate fruits and vegetables and sources of polyphenols and other things that come along with carbohydrates in a lot of foods.
Yeah, it's almost at either end of those extremes, you're pushing something else out.
Right.
Because at the opposite end, the very, very high carb diet, at some point you're pushing out those healthy fats that we spoke about and potentially pushing out some protein.
Yep.
Which is, both of those are super interesting to kind of populations to think about. The one case where I think there might be a more compelling argument for carb restriction is earlier at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about what's driving cardiometabolic disease, and we spoke about the role of ectopic fat. And you mentioned that, as fat's building up in the liver and then in the pancreas and you have insulin resistance, the pancreas is working harder and harder and harder and harder. I have to think that if that's been happening for a long time, as 10, 15 years, maybe someone's had pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes for over a decade, and their pancreas is just really, really worn out, that even if they're able to lose some weight, they they're not able to get that sort of beta cell function, kicking back into gear. And in that case, I would imagine a carb-restricted diet could be advantageous.
Well, again, moderate carbohydrate restriction, I think, very reasonable. And then also enough exercise so that you're, utilizing that carbohydrate. And also exercise helps you to sort of empty out those stores of glycogen in the muscles and then refill them. So I think that, highly restrictive, very low carbohydrate diets, I'm not a fan of those, but I am a fan of a moderate carbohydrate diet with enough viscous fiber to slow down that absorption and enough exercise to make sure that you're utilizing that carbohydrate and not shuttling that carbohydrate into de novo lipogenesis and not having too much of a glycemic load hitting over and over again and really taxing the pancreas.
Right. So it's a tool, it's a strategy, there's a place for it. And there's the intentionality piece is around having enough viscous fiber, exercise, and a bias for unsaturated fats.
Exactly.
And that is a much different sort of low carbohydrate diet approach to going super low carb, eating a lot of saturated fats and not exercising and not consuming enough viscous fiber.
So it is kind of like an overall lifestyle versus just focusing on the carbs, which, some people do. And I mean, I'll definitely acknowledge that there are people who are following a ketogenic diet because of certain health conditions where they feel better or, refractory epilepsy, those types of things. So a ketogenic diet has its place for patients who truly do see benefit from that. But that's typically something that they're following with supervision and someone is making sure that it's developed in a way that is going to be more nutritionally sound versus somebody who's told by their primary care provider to start following a ketogenic diet and they're left on their own to try to figure that out.
Right. Without the additional advice around diet quality.
Right. And the other things that you mentioned,
Kevin, before we forget, talk to us about how protein and fiber are affecting the other end of the equation. So not how many calories we're consuming, satiety, hunger, but the amount of calories our body is utilizing.
Sure. So protein, we know acutely will increase diet-induced thermogenesis. So there are three components to energy expenditure. Resting energy expenditure, and that's most. It's about 70% of what you burn calories is just resting energy expenditure. And then there's diet-induced thermogenesis, and that is about 10% of calories. And that is when you eat a meal, your metabolic rate goes up. And then you have physical activity. So those are the three components. And so acutely, higher protein will increase diet-induced thermogenesis. Over time, that seems to shift. So we have a paper that's under review now. It's a meta-analysis. And what we found, without going into a lot of detail, is essentially that acutely we do see this increase in diet-induced thermogenesis, but in chronic studies, we see increased 24-hour energy expenditure, but we don't really see that increase in diet-induced thermogenesis. And so what we think is going on there is that protein is anabolic, and so a higher protein diet will tend to increase lean body mass, and lean body mass is the main factor that determines resting energy expenditure. During weight loss, people lose lean body mass, and lean body mass is, skeletal muscle is about half of it, and then it's also other things. It's skin and connective tissue and other organ tissue.
Muscle.
So skeletal muscle is about 50%, and then, lots of other things, organ tissues, connective tissue, etc. And so when people are losing weight, they will lose lean body mass. What's not clear is exactly how much of that lean body mass is skeletal muscle. There's also quite a lot of variation between people. And of course, if you lose weight, it makes sense to lose some skeletal muscle because you don't need as much muscle to carry around a smaller frame or a smaller mass. And so One of the advantages of increased protein intake is it helps you limit the loss of lean body mass with weight loss. And then if you add resistance exercise, that further helps to reduce that, and that helps to maintain or build skeletal muscle mass. And of course, the more lean body mass you have, the more energy expenditure in the resting state. So that's helpful. Fibers, specifically fermentable fibers, seem to increase energy expenditure, and that's probably through release of short-chain fatty acids that affect brown fat in a way that increases energy expenditure. There may be some other mechanisms as well, but exercise obviously increases energy expenditure. Higher protein does, and higher fiber, fermentable fiber, does. And so again, we're trying to affect appetite with protein and fiber, and then energy expenditure with protein, fiber, and exercise.
It's quite the jigsaw puzzle, because like all of the kind of landscape that we've gone over, we've been speaking about reducing hunger, so reducing the hunger gap.
Right.
Okay. Being able to reduce ectopic fat, so getting body fat down, particularly ectopic fat, but while at the same time preserving bone and muscle tissue as best as possible.
Right.
So this framework that you have is kind of targeted at achieving or hoping to achieve those three things as best as possible.
That's what we're hoping for. Yep.
Okay. And so then the exercise component, which you've sort of alluded to there, I'm assuming is a combination of aerobic and resistance training?
Yeah, we focus on both. We would advise people to do both. And we say 30 minutes a day minimum. And so that's going to be 210. If you do it 7 days a week, it's 210 minutes at the minimum. And so what we know from exercise studies is that exercise enhances weight loss, but it seems to be the strongest predictor of being able to maintain weight loss. So, we know that there are lots of ways to lose weight. It's keeping the weight off that's most difficult. And when we look at people who've been successful at keeping off a significant amount of lost weight, the strongest predictor is how much they exercise. And people who have lost, say, 30 pounds and kept it off for an extended period, they average about an hour a day of walking and similar kinds of moderate intensity exercise. And, that we would advocate including resistance exercise to help maintain skeletal muscle mass as well.
Is that a direct effect of the energy that would be expended during the activity, or is exercise also influencing hunger and appetite?
I think it's influencing hunger and appetite. I think it's also that if you're out walking, you're not watching television and seeing, food cues every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes when you're watching a TV show. If you pay attention to what's on television, you see commercials come on with food, and they're food cues that people are getting all the time. And I mentioned that, more than 50% of people's energy intake tends to happen after 4 p.m. Well, a lot of it happens when people are sitting on the couch. Stationary. And you're not going to be eating if you're out walking. So I think there are a lot of elements to it. I think there are effects on appetite. I think there are effects on just, eating less because you're doing something active. And I think that the energy expenditure is important because we know that the 150 minutes a week that is recommended for general health is not enough to promote weight loss. And to promote weight loss, you need sort of 200 to 400 minutes a week of exercise. And when you look at people who have maintained a weight loss, they tend to be doing about an hour a day of walking or equivalent activities, an hour to a bit more than that.
Have you come across Herman Poncer? Herman Poncer.
I know the name, but
he wrote a book called Burn.
Okay, I know the name, but I don't
I'll
know the
send you a
person.
link to it. We can continue that conversation off air.
Okay.
Because that's probably going to send us down a giant rabbit hole. And at this stage, if anyone's still listening, I think we're doing well. We might be at 3 hours. Thanks to those that are still with us. Okay, so let's tie all of this up together. So the 30-30-30 study itself, when are you hoping that will begin? How long is that trial?
So we hope that we'll start the study next year. We have some commitment for funding, but we don't have the whole thing funded yet. So we are, in discussions with potential funders, and we want the intervention period to be at least 16 weeks for a weight loss component. We'd prefer more like, half a year. And if we can get enough funding, then we'd like to have a weight maintenance element to it as well. But of course, somebody's got to pay the bills to do all of the things that we'd like to do. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to make it a study that's, longer than 6 months. And then we can really look at weight maintenance, because while I think people will lose more weight with a 30-30-30 program than a traditional program, I think it's at least as important to look at how well they maintain that weight loss. And, maybe that ends up being a separate study, but we'd like to make it one study.
And as you mentioned before, in the low carb literature, you see in the first 6 months a diet can behave one way, and then from 6 to 18 months it looks a little different.
Right. And that's not just low carb. I think that's, there's been multiple studies that looked at different types of weight loss diets, and the same thing happens. I think it's just difficult for people to adhere to something. Like, they can do it for a little bit, and especially if you're looking at restriction, they can focus on that for a little bit, but over time it becomes more difficult. And that's where I think, the behavioral, as we're talking, I'm like, Kevin, we need a behavioral component for our intervention.
Oh, we certainly do. And that's important. Rather than focusing mainly on restriction, we're focusing on goals to achieve. Right. And I think that's, from a mindset standpoint, I think that's an important element.
Right. And I guess ensuring that whatever those behavioral strategies are accessible to a population.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because the next question I have, and we might be skipping ahead, and you might think, well, we just want to conduct the study first. But I'm thinking, as scientists, you must think about what is the potential real world, application. So if the 30-30-30 study is proven successful and people do significantly better, how do you see that kind of affecting public health recommendations? Is that something that you even think about, or are you just the scientists and then that's for other people to deal with once you've published the results?
Well, I think our view is the policy recommendations, or the public health guidance, should be derived from what the evidence shows. And so if we produce evidence that supports this as an approach, then we think that will affect the recommendations, and we might, advocate for that, or at least make sure that the people making those decisions are aware of the results from our studies. One of the challenges is that, you've got to publish good research results, but then you've got to make sure that the right people are aware of them so that they take them into account when they're making recommendations. And in theory, this happens through systematic reviews and so forth. But in practice, we find that a lot of good research doesn't make it into the recommendations because people are not aware of it.
I just remembered another dad joke.
Oh, jeez.
My partner left a note on the fridge this morning. She wrote, "Things are, this is not working. Goodbye." And I opened the fridge door. It worked just perfectly.
You remind me, my wife, when I left, she was upset with me, and I asked her why, and she said, "Well, it was you asking me when dinner would be ready." And I said, "What's so bad about that?" She said, "You should have at least waited until I finised mowing the lawn."
Oh my God, you guys.
On that note, Carol, I think we did it. How do you feel?
Good.
Feel good? Feel good? Okay, we'll come back and report once you've finished the study and you have some results to share with us. But as I said at the top here, it's always nice to sit down with people whose work I've digested myself for many years, and the goal of this show is to expose listeners to real scientists who use words like uncertain, which you used quite a few times, which I do not see as a lack of confidence or a lack of knowledge, but more someone who is objective and just communicating things objectively, which is, where what I think people can benefit most from, and helps clear up a lot of confusion in a climate where there is so much absolute and hyperbole online. So thank you to both of you for all of the work you've done, the peer-reviewed papers you've been involved in, and taking up the opportunity to join me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. You should have Kevin back, and maybe you can outdo Tom Dayspring on how many hours you guys talk.
The challenge has been thrown out there. We'll see.
We love Tom. He corrects me.
We do. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the invite.
You're welcome. There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.